Hello and welcome. My name is Richard Heaton, and if you've never heard from me before, I live in the UK and I've been interested in British and Irish family and social history since my early teens. About 20 years ago, this led to an interest in printed sources for family history, typically directories, poll books, and later newspapers. Now, I guess I'm rather unusual as a family historian because 20 years on, I've amassed around 100,000 original British and Irish newspapers, mainly 18th and 19th century, including copies of a very rare publication called the Police Gazette. Copies for the UK, Ireland, Australia and New Zealand. Not only that, but when I can afford to do so, I get the newspapers scanned and digitize them so they can be accessed by any researcher via the web. And as a member of the Guild of One Name Studies, I thought the Police Gazette, being a particularly useful publication, it might be of interest to other members and also to family historians in general. So I've put together a little bit of information that I know in the presentation you're about to see, in the hope it helps others with their research. I've kept the title really simple. Why you need the Police Gazette. And a brief overview for you. We're going to cover what the UK Police Gazette actually was, when and why it was created, what you might find in it, a little bit about the illustrations and advertisements, where we can find original copies, and then what we can find available to search online. We'll then have a quick look at the Irish Police Gazette, and finally we'll wrap up with a look at the gazettes for Australia, New Zealand, and a gazette I've never seen a copy of yet, the Gazette for India. The Police Gazette was a newspaper, printed and published in London from the late 18th century onwards. The contents consisted of notices detailing crimes with names and descriptions of criminals wanted. So if you've got a criminal ancestor or a possible criminal ancestor, this could be really wonderful. It also served as a wanted list for deserters from the armed forces. And again, that could be really useful for your research. It wasn't just in the UK, as I've said. Another newspaper with a similar title was printed and published in Dublin from the first quarter of the 19th century, with coverage of Ireland. And police gazettes existed for, following a similar structure, Australia and New Zealand, and probably for India. I've put in a number of illustrations from my own collection throughout the presentation, and for this to kick us off with the early origins of the Police Gazette, I thought we'd start with a portrait of George III. This has come from something called the Georgian Scrapbook, which is a scrapbook which starts from the late 18th century and ran into the Victorian times, which I've scanned and put up on Pinterest for anybody to have a look at. The reason I've picked out George III is really it's his reign and his lifetime, certainly his lifetime, that the Police Gazette initiated and really got going. And within his lifetime it was first printed. By the time he died, it was well established. Crime was a preoccupation during the 18th century, and it was felt to be on the increase, violent crime in particular. This picture therefore may seem a bit of an odd choice. We've got a man dressed in a ragged coat with a pannier on his back. In his left hand he's supporting himself with a stick, and in his right hand he's holding some kind of canister, maybe a box, possibly with a slit in the top. And the title across the top of the illustration is "Pray Remember the Poor Prisoners." Now this is from a series of images, Cries of London, which was engraved and sold by a Mr. Kirk, one I think of a family of engravers, in St Paul's Churchyard. And this was printed around about 1755, 1756. Now, why might this be in any way relevant to the Police Gazette? Well, he's thought to represent a soldier who's been discharged, possibly he's been injured, and he's begging for alms. What had been observed during the 18th century, or perceived, was that during wars, violent crime fell. But this would reverse when peace arrived. And around the time, just before the time this print was produced, so in 1749-50, there were about 70 to 80,000 men who came home from the wars. Now, many of those may have found gainful employment, but a lot of them would have been labourers. Some may have had some trades, and they may have struggled. And it was those who might have been struggling, who might have been tempted into crime, or so the thought went. And as I've said, crime was a concern in the 18th century. Whether it was higher or lower in the 1750s, I don't know. But the 1750s would spark a bit of a change. I've got a couple of illustrations for you here. There's a title page of a book by Henry Fielding, which I've taken from Google Books, and a print from exactly the same time, really, by William Hogarth, very well known. It's Gin Lane. Henry Fielding, if he's remembered for anything today, I guess is as the author of Tom Jones, which was a story of how a foundling comes into a fortune. In 1751, he published this inquiry into the late increase in robbers, which postulated that the robbers and the robberies were driven by a general rise in wealth and luxury, and the desire to imitate that, drunkenness, particularly gin, hence the Gin Lane example, the poor state of prisons, and the difficulty in bringing criminals to justice, including receivers of stolen goods, because if the threat of justice and punishment wasn't really there, then there was basically no disincentive for crime. And he also featured his concerns about wandering vagabonds, like the gentleman we saw begging for alms in the previous slide. By 1751, he would have been very familiar with this subject. He'd been appointed a Westminster magistrate in 1748 as a result of his political views, and would later become chairman of the Westminster Sessions. Unusually, and this is why I guess he's most important to us, he was both energetic and honest, and noticed for his impartial judgments. Henry was joined by his half-brother John Fielding, who came in as a personal assistant in 1750. John becomes a Westminster magistrate in his own right in 1751, and on Henry's death in 1754 he becomes a magistrate for Bow Street. He was knighted, Sir John Fielding, in 1761, which takes us to Sir John Fielding's plan. As I've said, Henry and John were both very energetic magistrates, and viewed almost as being probably some of the best magistrates that London has seen in the 18th century. Sir John Fielding's plan of police, which was put together in 1761, 1763, is to appoint 5 or 6 magistrates of police with separate offices where they may give regular attendance with fixed salaries and therefore act without fee or reward. Previously, magistrates may have been receiving basically a reward from those who sought to influence the judgments. A bribe, if you prefer. The offices to be in different parts of the town, not only for Middlesex and Westminster, but for the counties of Surrey, Hertford, Essex and Kent, to prevent the loss of time which usually happens in getting warrants backed in those counties. What was happening, if you were a criminal, you may well commit a crime in one county and then nip over the border into another county. And it may take some time to get a warrant to get you back to where and tried where you committed your crime. Separate registers would be kept of information with copies sent to the centre office, which is Bow Street, and the Secretary of State for War was to transmit names and descriptions of all deserters. It doesn't say so, but it implies the Secretary of State for War may be keeping a list. Fees, so there would be fees, would be only there to pay for rent of offices, payment of clerks and messengers' wages, rewards to peace officers, so rewards for resolving crimes, advertisements, opinions of counsel and prosecutions. Magistrates, they would meet once a month at the centre office to consider nuisances and organise foot patrols in the fields about London, I guess to focus on where they thought the crime was most prevalent. The Lord Lieutenant of Middlesex was requested to provide cautions on licensing public houses, and most important for us, a paper be established by law in which everything relative to discovery of offenders should be advertised. And that paper, of course, was a newspaper, and that paper would ultimately become the Police Gazette. Here's a sort of a potted history of how we get to the Police Gazette. From the 1750s to 1760s, the Fielding brothers advertised crime, and they advertised details and descriptions of individuals wanted. They used the Public Advertiser, and Henry Fielding had an interest in, and he also had an interest, if he didn't run, the Covent Garden Journal, which is a short run publication in 1752, and almost certainly that was pushing the same message. But we have to wait to 1772, so quite some time after Sir John Fielding's plan, for the first editions of the Public Hue and Cry to be published. It's difficult to tell, but at some time, we know in 1793, I've tracked down an advertisement in another newspaper called The Sun, which states that the Hue and Cry and Police Gazette will no longer be free, which was interesting because this is the first reference to the Police Gazette, and it does confirm that the publication was being distributed free up till then. In 1797, there is a Hue and Cry and Police Gazette, which commenced around September of that year and was published every 3 weeks. So my current assumption is there was a publication with the same title before then, but a slightly different format, which I haven't tracked down yet. Then between 1828 to 1839, there's a Police Gazette or Hue and Cry, which was published weekly. And then we move on to the longest lasting of the Police Gazette types, UK Police Gazette that is. This is 1839 running through to 1884. And this was published up to 3 times a week. In 1884, a new series was introduced, which was weekly. There was one publication covering crime and one publication covering deserters. This lasted up to 1914, when another new series was introduced, which is a smaller format paper, which consisted of multiple supplements, including deserters. Now that lasted probably up to the end of World War II, around about then. Now, whether it's down to paper rationing or some post-war cutback or shortage, but the Police Gazette after then, I've got a run of the Police Gazette from 1946, not 1846, 1946 through to 1956, and those are basically all these supplements, which we'll have a look at in a minute, are all condensed into one publication, with the exception of deserters, which doesn't appear and I assume was a separate sheet. Now here's an example of the Hue and Cry and Police Gazette from pre-1828. This was published once every 3 weeks. This example's from 1816, and this was at a cost of 7p. It's basically one single sheet of paper, like a modern newspaper, but just one sheet, printed on both sides, crime on the front page and deserters from the War Office, so these are army deserters, on the rear page. We're looking at June 1816, so we still have deserters in this paper from Waterloo. Moving forward a little bit in time, 1828 to 1839, this is the Police Gazette or Hue and Cry. So this newspaper was much smaller in size than the previous one. We've moved to a format of just 2 pages or 4 sides of print. This was free and printed twice a week on a Tuesday and Friday. The deserters lists were printed across the inside pages. Sometimes you'll find, instead of the deserters lists, convicts wanted, believed to escape from Australia. And the rest of the paper is taken up by crime and charges. So charges of individuals who are named at the different police stations, typically in London. This is the largest run of the Police Gazette. The format increased quite dramatically, so the size of the paper. The quality of the paper declined, however, so it was very, very thin, so almost like a cost-saving exercise. By 1861, the page count, which had previously, if you like, been in the previous version, around about 2 pages of 4 pages of print, had increased to 3 and 4 pages, or 6 or 8 pages of print, and these were printed up to 3 times a week, with potentially different information in different ones. There's a fair bit repeated in a week, but there's quite a lot of different stuff. Habitual criminals, for example, appear, I think, in the midweek one as you get later in the Victorian period. And these are individuals who habitually were believed to commit crimes or had a track record of committing crimes, and it would provide details of when they're expected to be released from jail, or if they had been released, if they were being sought to be locked up again because they hadn't confirmed with the conditions for their release, such as regularly going in and visiting the police station. This newspaper remained free of charge, and no charge was made for notices submitted or printed in the Gazette. I should say the lists of deserters could take up half of the newspaper, so quite significant. The new series starts in 1884 and ran until 1913. This was a slightly different format again. Basically, it's about 4 pages of crime. It was published weekly, and there's a separate sheet for deserters, all in one Gazette. The innovation was the inclusion of pictures of those who were wanted, either photographs or woodcut engravings, sometimes also of objects that had been stolen. These were almost certainly, the woodcuts would have been taken from engravings, and they were replacing what had been previously used in up to 1884, which were basically flyers, posters, which had been inserted in the Police Gazette. This is the final series I'm going to look at, which is ran from around 1914 probably to 1945. I'm not entirely certain, but I think that's probably how far it ran to. This would be a Police Gazette, could be 8 or 9 pages, plus supplements, and the supplements were numbered or lettered A to E and G. A would be travelling criminals, C, wanted aliens, so individuals who not born in the UK, didn't have a UK residence, they may have jumped ship, they may have been working in the UK and committed a crime, or they may have just been asked to be expelled from the UK. And D, deserters. Just coming back to travelling criminals, these are a list of basically semi-professional, I guess. I don't know if you can have, it's difficult to say professional criminal, but we've got professional criminals here who you'd have a photograph frequently, face on and side on views, and further details of the crimes they've committed and what they're wanted for inside, often with fingerprints. Excluding deserters, which was the only supplement which, as far as I'm aware, didn't reduce in size and format, the Weekly Gazette pre-World War II could amount to over 20 pages, so it was quite a bulky document and in lots of different parts. And you can see how those parts, for example, could easily get lost unless they were filed immediately. And some of the earlier series of gazettes, which were printed on very fine paper, you can see how those could get torn, or possibly the pictures would be cut out and put on a police notice board. And regardless, there was no intention to keep these gazettes for any great length of time. We'll have a look at crime, I should probably be inverted commas, in the Police Gazette. This is part of an illustration from the front page of something else masquerading as a Police Gazette. It's called the Penny Sunday Times and People's Police Gazette, which was published in London, and this was from 1841. So we're going to have a look at a number of examples of details of descriptions and crimes, just some examples that were printed in the Gazette, just to give you a flavour for what you might find. There are tens of thousands, I don't know, 100,000s, it's difficult to really know, notices that would help you with your research. Earlier I mentioned the Fieldings, John and Henry, and how they advertised in public newspapers. This is an example from the Public Advertiser of 1764. Henry Fielding had a connection with the Public Advertiser, but this is 10 years after he died in Portugal. And so this has been placed by his brother, Sir John Fielding. Whereas one Hosey Roberts stands charged upon oath before Sir John Fielding for feloniously taking and carrying away £60 and upwards out of a dwelling house of Mr. John Carruthers, whoever will secure the above Hosey Roberts, or give such information to the above magistrate so that he may be apprehended, shall receive 2 guineas reward on his commitment. Under which there's a useful description. N.B. He is a barber by business, 19 years of age, about 5 feet 8 inches high, short dark hair, over which she sometimes wears a wig. Had on a light fustian frock, a light cloth waistcoat and light breeches. Born in Cornwall. Well, that's a pretty good description of Jose. Now we'll move on. I can only pick out a few examples in this talk, so I've moved this on from 1764 right the way up to 1831, so pretty close to when that print for Bow Street was being produced. This isn't the Police Gazette or Hue and Cry. We've got a crime, and again we've got a description. Hope you enjoy it. On Wednesday morning, the 27th, about 6 o'clock, William King of 21 St Anne's Street, Westminster, had his pocket picked of 8 sovereigns by his fellow lodger Charles Collis, who is 5 feet 4 inches high, lame with the left leg, has rather sandy hair, grey eyes, stammers in his speech and gets his living by sitting with a pauper to induce charitable relief. That's a pretty good description. And if you're related to William King or you're related to Charles Collis, that would certainly add some flavour to your family history. For our last notice, I've moved us on to 1869. And I apologise in advance, my Welsh is not good. This is a description of Jane Williams, alias Evans, alias Madron. So we're dealing with a lady with multiple aliases, who absconded from Bethely, charged with stealing a pair of slippers, brackets recovered. She was a native of Amerlook, Anglesey, about 35 years of age, 5 feet 3 inches high, slender make, grey eyes, brown hair, rather thin face, fair complexion, and lost 1 or 2 upper front teeth. She goes about the country hawking sundry things from a basket. She is well known to all the police in North Wales and has been convicted of larceny at Knutsford, Beaumaris and Carnarvon. Information to be given to Inspector Williams, 4 Crosses, Bethely, Carnarvonshire, who holds a warrant for her apprehension. This is again a typical example of a notice. We've got a description. In this case they're well known, but in 1869, of course, we aren't seeing pictures. We'll come across those in a bit. But first it's worth just stepping back a second. We've just run into some aliases, and certainly in the Police Gazette aliases are really quite common. I've picked out a handful of examples here, and you can see how one name doesn't necessarily, one might be a nickname, but in many instances one name doesn't connect to another. And I often wonder whether somebody may be researching family A without any idea that their ancestor or distant relative may have actually been using surname B or C. So let's have a look. We've got firstly George Barrett, alias Gibson, alias Mickey, of East Street, Marylebone, a stableman, 24 years of age. So you've got a George Barrett or George Gibson, possibly Mickey Barrett or Mickey Gibson. Thomas Dodson, alias Daylight. Margaret Kemp, alias MacDonald, alias King, alias Mary Wilson, alias Mary Ann Robinson. Thomas Canaran, alias Trapeze Tom, formerly a trapeze performer with Mrs Howes and Cushing Circus, but latterly an omnibus driver. John Mitchell, alias Gooseberry, a bargeman. Elizabeth Butler, alias Chikey. So where did Chikey come from? She states that her husband's name is Charles Butler. His nickname, Chikey. Elizabeth Edwards, alias Joan, alias Bet Stable. Rose and Hughes, alias Hewitt, alias Spence, alias Williams, alias Jane Smith, alias Bridget Farrell, alias Rosanna Irvin. William Weston, alias Charles Gray, alias Slenderman. William Warren, alias George Spanglet of London Labourer. And finally, I've picked out, just randomly, George Broughton, alias Martin Bartolier of London Labourer. Over the last few slides, we've been having a look at the different types of information that were recorded to enable the detection and identification of offenders. We've had detailed descriptions, we've had aliases. We will have a look in part 2 at illustrations and portraits. But just to finish part 1, we'll have a look at tattoos. And this is an example taken from 1872. Many descriptions will just go so far, so they'll give the details of height, eye colour, hair colour, and then stop. This description starts in the same way, but then, as you'll see, we'll soon move on to a very detailed description of the tattoos. Joseph Morgan of Leicester, a scale maker, 42 years of age, 5 feet 4 inches high, sallow complexion, dark brown hair, grey eyes, broad face. So far, fairly normal description. 2 men, woman, tree, anchor, WPEAS, cross pipes, JP, flower pot and a blue ring on left arm, blue dots, back of left hand, a ring on long finger, cross flags, cross arrows, anchor, star, ring and crucifix on right arm, and finally a blue mark on the left leg. So quite a comprehensive list of tattoos and very well documented. It makes you wonder whether Joseph Morgan may have been a repeat offender. But regardless, with a description like that, it would have been very difficult for him, whether he used an alias or not, if he was picked up or spotted, not to be identified and arrested. Thank you for listening. That brings us to the end of part 1.